read the slides, I'm not gonna lie, and I read, why is the government a bad idea? Sorry.
Organization,
Yeah.
human organization was a mistake.
This isn't a
Return to
libertarian
crab.
meeting.
All right, we are live.
Okay, awesome. So hi everyone, welcome to today's talk. We'll be basically talking about what civic tech is, how you can get more involved, and basically like leading into this idea of like, why is the government so bad at technology? I think obviously a lot of people here, if you're like at Change Hacks, you're probably someone who like, you want to use technology for like more access and more equity, and you're probably also a little turned off from the idea of like working for government just because everything you hear about bureaucracy and inefficiencies. And so we're going to kind of talk about like this concept of civic technology, what it is, and like how we can improve it. And so first and foremost, what is CTP? We're basically an organization for people to learn more about the social impact of technology, technology current events, and technology politics. We're basically like a very scholastic forward organization in the sense that like we as a group really like to just like learn about different things and present about different things and just kind of get like a more informed sense of the world. Apart from that, we also enjoy like doing things that promote general civic engagement, political activism, and careers in civic tech. We have also done different like service events, like we collected like extra recruiting t-shirts from CS students and like we're able to make those into bags and donated them. And we've also like partnered with nonprofits in the past to help them with different tech challenges. And so all in all, we're all about just being like better and more informed citizens by way of technology, which I think a lot of people here are probably also interested in. And yeah, we're also a big reason we're here is, just to have a good time. And so, like I mentioned, some of our past activities. So this last 3 years, we've had like a talk every single week. Usually, we've done guest speakers of like professors, industry members. We did this big event last semester with like a civic tech careers panel with like people from all walks of life. We wrote and published a zine. We have a book club, and et cetera, et cetera. And so if you want to like keep up with us, a lot of the people in the Slack are now graduating, but we all still are like people who are really interested in civic tech, and we usually post like different articles and have different discussions. And so like definitely join our Slack if you're someone who like is interested in this kind of thing. And if you're looking for like our various different PowerPoints and talks and resources, our Google Drive is also a really good resource. So yeah, like without further ado, we'll get right into it. And so there's like no sugarcoating the idea that government technology is just a bit subpar. And so usually people like their experience on government websites tends to be really painful. You tend to see these really like clunky like 90s UIs. They often like the requests won't go through. It's just a not pleasant end-to-end experience. And considering how heavily, digital media, digital infrastructure is used now, we would think that a lot of this should be considered like as critical as something like a library or a fire station or like a school, but we still don't have that kind of same classification for things considered government technology. And so all in all, what this does is it creates frustrated citizens that can't be well served by their like institutions, their governments, and just frustrated governments that aren't able to like distribute services effectively and aren't able to like reach citizens. And so, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so like a really, I think, classic example that we've all probably recently seen is like in trying to get vaccine appointments online, it's often been like a really painful process. And so this was a tweet from Kara Swisher, who's like a really famous tech reporter, where like even she like wasn't able to navigate the like Washington DC vaccine site because of like bugs and like the CAPTCHA technology. A really common idea that we see is that like, oh, the government spent $1 gajillion to build a website and it still sucks. There's often a lot of times been like really ambitious projects started only for them to get canceled. And I think the most infamous one, which we'll talk about later, is even like really essential services like health insurance. When the government has tried to roll those out, they've pretty much botched it. And this is like yet another example of like I mentioned, a gajillion dollars gets scrapped, gets canceled, no real final end product. And so you might be thinking, like, why can't the government just like, hire a bunch of like engineers to like pound out a website in like a day, much like students do like a hackathon? And probably like the biggest impediment to that is this process the government has to go through called procurement. And so when the government needs to buy things, it's not allowed to just like pull up an Amazon page, order it, and have it come through. They have to go through this process called procurement, which is basically like the end-to-end process of like buying something that the government needs. And so there are like 6 like pretty big steps that are involved in the procurement process. So first you have to conduct market research. So like, let's say there's like a hypothetical situation where the government like needs to buy road salt to salt the roads in order to like have safe driving conditions when it snows. So first they basically have to go out and they have to say like, why do we need this road salt? And they have to come up with some kind of like a reasoning, some kind of a justification why like they need to spend like a couple $1,000s on road salt. Then they like write all of this information up in a document called a bid solicitation or an RFP. RFP stands for requests for proposals. And this is basically where they're like, hey world, we need a bunch of road salt. If you want to sell us road salt, let us know. So then they publish that and they market the bid. They try to send it to like different construction companies, things like that, being like, do you want to sell the government road salt? Then they review those bids that they get. Then they basically have to go through this really long process where they negotiate the terms of a contract with the company. So they're like, okay, like you're going to pay us this much. We're going to, do it for this long. You're going to get XYZ tax benefit. And it's a lot of back and forth. It's a lot of like person to person communication to get that contract written. And finally, you can conduct a purchase. And so just imagine for like every single like grocery item, Amazon item, online shopping you did, you basically had to go through this like heavily complicated like 6-step purchase with like tons of back and forth to buy everything. You basically like would be really bad at buying things. You'd be really bad at just like being able to like serve yourself with like different items. And so procurement is a huge impediment in the current moment to just having like really well functioning governments that are able to like really easily distribute resources to people. And so because this process is so painful, there are often several little workarounds that the government will try to make happen in order to like more easily buy stuff. So one is pricing under threshold. So what this means is like only past, I think, around like 300K or like 30K maybe, do you have to actually go through the procurement process. So governments will sometimes try to buy things in pieces. So they can price each individual piece below like the actual threshold to have to do the procurement process. So this ends up being like really clunky, really disorganized, not a great way in general to like do anything. Sole source, which is basically saying that like this person is the only person we're aware that can sell us this product, so they automatically get the contract. And the last, which is honestly like the nicest thing, is cooperative purchasing. And the way cooperative purchasing works is, let's say the city of San Antonio wants to buy road salt, but Austin, Texas already has a really good contract. The city of San Antonio can call up the city of Austin and be like, hey, can I like get in on this road salt contract you have? And the city of Austin will be like, sure, like that sounds good. The problem with every single one of these kind of workarounds is they basically end up favoring incumbents, meaning that people who have historically gotten contracts, people who have historically become government vendors, they almost always end up being the people who win contracts. And so that isn't great if they don't necessarily have a really good track record of delivering high quality products. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail, but this is kind of like an intro to the procurement process and why it kind of begets so many like just low quality forms of not just software, but like everything. Like road salt is a decent example. And so, like I mentioned, like this process is really difficult. And some of the reasons why it is so difficult is that government contracting basically requires perfect scopes of work and precise definitions. And so the contract that gets written up between like a vendor and a government often has to be highly specific. It has to lay out like week by week what like deliverables are going to happen, what like kinds of like who is going to work on the project, and like how long it takes. And so if anyone has ever worked on like a company or like just in general on like any kind of programming project, you know that like the plan that you start out with at the very beginning very rarely is like the plan that ends up getting executed by the very end. And so this kind of like perfect scoping of work and like perfect definitions of like what needs to be done ends up being really incompatible with like the software development process. There's something called like the Anti-Deficiency Act that basically like lays out like in order for there not to be like unexpected costs in a government contract, you need to be able to like lay out these things like super precisely. The second is that agencies are like rightfully obsessed with data security. And so it's one thing if like, you know, a tech company gets breached, doesn't have like as high security versus if like the government, if that happens to the government. So they basically like are not able to like incrementally build up to a project, like create like an MVP or like a minimum viable product. They basically like from 0 to end need to create like the most tip top shape, like final product. And that often like ends up like just creating like very clunky, very poorly thought out projects. They're also like in the context of data security, is no real guidance on the proper terms and conditions to include in a federal contract, which is kind of like incompatible with the first point, and that definitions need to be pretty precise. But because like a lot of the people who are often like writing up these contracts are like city employees, state employees who are like, you know, they're not computer security professionals. They don't know how exactly to like lay out the terms of like how secure something needs to be. Like how secure do you need to like maintain your MongoDB database? Like that's not something that like a city official is able to like really clearly lay out in terms. Which kind of leads me to this third point in that procurement officials are tasked with just way too much, right? They need to be able to put like precise definitions of like computer security things, but also things like within the realm of like infrastructure and chemical engineering, right? Like this is just asking one person to have too much knowledge and too much context into like way too many different domains. And then the last is that the process is really decentralized. Basically every kind of scope of government from like the federal level all the way down to like the county and city level is dealing with like different issues of procurement. And there's pretty much no like formal channels of communication between each one. I mentioned on the previous slide, like cooperative purchasing, even though that seems like a really neat idea, kind of like calling up your friends and asking them what products they bought, there's no formal channels for cities to actually do that. And finding a cooperative contract is actually a lot harder said than done. And so all of this basically leads into software procurement just being an impossible challenge. It is one uniquely big. So I basically compared the idea of like an MVP that like a startup might put out. Like the government doesn't have the chance to do that. They basically all at once, like the federal government needs to create a product that can serve like 300 people all at once. And so if you think about every startup that has ever existed, they've probably started out in like a beta testing phase, you know, where they served like 100 people, then 1,000 people, slowly like building that up until like they have a product that can scale. The government doesn't really have the luxury of doing that. And so like imagine like trying to write a software that 300 million people can use all at once. Huge challenge. It is uniquely old. And so there is like so much legacy code that exists in governments because they're basically like the first people to ever start creating software, and maintaining, like you can't just like burn it all to the ground because a lot of this stuff like needs to stay up for like amount of time and like can't necessarily like go down at arbitrary points. There's a lot of like outsourcing that happens. And so you have these like uniquely really old systems that the government has to maintain, but no one in the government has actually written any of that code. It's all been written by like third-party companies and like outsourced companies. And so imagine like coming into a job and they're like, hey, like maintain this like 30-year-old data code base that nobody here can explain to you how any of it works. Fourth is like politics, like things are expensive and there are certain people who don't want to pay for like enough money in order to like make things happen. And so that unfortunately ends up being like a really big impediment to things being effective. And last, like I mentioned, like these things need to be super, super stable and need to scale like almost immediately all at once, which is just like very challenging to do. And so I kind of mentioned this earlier, but the current procurement process really heavily favors current vendors. And so there was a story a couple months ago in like ProPublica that basically talked about Deloitte and the software called VAMS. They basically were awarded a no bid contract. So that means that they were the sole source provider of $40 million, and they basically built an unusable software. The report basically talked about like different hospitals and doctors like being given it, but like not even using it because it was simply like, you couldn't even click on things. It was like just unusable from like end to end. And so this is an example of like Deloitte as a company repeatedly over and over again wins these contracts. Like in 2014, they won this unemployment website contract, $78 million, and no one basically has been able to receive their unemployment benefits through the website that Deloitte built. IBM as well, like repeatedly receives like these $110 million deals to modernize different websites, and it never gets finished. And so like, if between you and me, we might think that like, okay, if Deloitte has historically done a horrible job at building these different kinds of like technologies, why are they still winning contracts? And the reason is because we pretty much just have a system where we can't find like different people to like write these things. Because like incumbents are repeatedly favored, we basically go ahead and award them a contract because they're really like the only people we're able to like find and clear through the like heavily complicated procurement process. Again, like because like a company maybe has once gone through the procurement process and already been vetted, a lot of people will just go through with them because they don't want to like shove a whole new company through the process. And so this like at the moment is basically like the unemployment system that exists in Florida. It looks ridiculous and it basically makes you wait for 10 minutes in order to like get into the actual website. And so you can imagine that like when COVID first struck and there was an unprecedented amount of people trying to file for unemployment benefits, a lot of these systems basically crashed all at once. An example of like the uniquely old system. Ritik, you want to take this one?
Yeah. So one like big example is in early March 2020 when first a lot of layoffs started happening and a lot of unemployment problems because of the pandemic. New Jersey and New York faced like massive systems failures, and part of this was because they were written in like COBOL, just very old technology. But this resulted in like New Jersey's governor tweeting out that does anybody know COBOL? We need like help fixing these systems. And so the average person involved with COBOL is 50 years old, and with tech like moving at such a fast pace, people or a lot of new tech workers don't want to go into government tech because of they don't want like a career in maintenance. And so like upgrading tech systems would eventually lead to younger tech workers moving into the government to do like tech work.
And it was funny because when Ritik went through when COVID hit, New York State experienced like a 900% increase in web traffic on their unemployment site, which led the government to request that New Yorkers only file for unemployment on designated days of the week assigned alphabetically. And so that's literally ridiculous, right? There are like millions of people who like are able to access Facebook every day all across the world, but the state of New York is like last name G, Thursdays it is. And so this is like a really good example of how like these uniquely old systems that like need to be maintained rather than kind of like burned to the ground, we simply just don't have the people available to like develop these kinds of systems. And so a really kind of like, I guess like kind of nerdy piece of like policy knowledge that also makes government tech really difficult is this thing called the Paperwork Reduction Act. And so the law itself is kind of awesome in its intent. It basically tries to reduce the amount of information the government can ask of you on paperwork. The exact wording that it uses is that it requires all federal websites request permission from the Office of Management and Budget before collecting information from 10 or more members of the public. So it's basically the intent of it was to make sure that like things like tax forms or like unemployment forms are not heavily complicated and can be filled out with like relative ease. But what has happened is that for a long time, and even now, this has led people to think that user research and like A/B testing is essentially illegal. Because if you are like collecting information on people without like requesting permission from the OMB, you are like violating the Paperwork Reduction Act. And so this has heavily slowed down development because you're basically not able to get like instantaneous feedback on websites. And you are also not able to figure out like if people maybe like are clicking on the wrong things and not actually accessing the right resources. If people are like not even able to, you know, like if a button on a website isn't even working, like they're not collecting that kind of like user information to kind of like iteratively improve the software. And so as a reform, it basically would be like a really good way to kind of reform the way we fill out forms. But currently it's like a big pain in the butt. This does include things like cookies. So like, yeah, something like if I want to collect a cookie, a lot of government agencies basically right now would assume that you have to go through OMB in order to like get permission to do that. And so, back on that point is that the interesting thing is that this currently like isn't actually entirely. Phones just died. Can anyone still hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. And so this currently like isn't necessarily like entirely true. The OMB has created exceptions for things like A/B testing within like the Paperwork Reduction Act, but people just don't have a really good knowledge of that. And so we just don't have like robust systems in place to do this kind of work. And this also leads back to the fact, as I mentioned, if you have to create a like completely final project like all at once and you don't have time to like iteratively improve on it, you basically like never actually create the space for things to like improve over time. They're basically, after a vendor like hands off software to the government, they are like kind of cut out from that process indefinitely. They never like come back, improve it. The developers are not like monitoring like how the users are using it. And there's like no real like back and forth to like improve the experience. And so it's basically like, imagine if like Google today looked like the exact same Google that like Larry and Sergey like once built. It wouldn't scale and it wouldn't work, which is often why a lot of these systems don't end up scaling towards like millions of people.
And so
no, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So like one thing that like the government should start taking from is like ways that the private industry has scaled. And so like Abby mentioned, the way that like private industry is using tools and resources and software development like paradigms to be able to grow are things that like the government needs to be able to use in order to have the same sort of benefits. But the issue there is like Abby mentioned earlier, is it's very difficult to procure these tools. For example, with things like security testing, to get a service in order to like test and like maintain the overall security, each organization is going to have to get that single service. And so, for example, like if like a Department of Defense and the Department of Justice both want the same thing, they both gonna have to go through separate procurement processes. And so like one way around this that has been recently developed is like FedRAMP, which is a GSA, which is General Services Administration's, things like technology something service, has like created FedRAMP in order to help a bunch of different organizations be able to get the same set of licensing in order to utilize cloud-based services and security services. So if one organization through FedRAMP is able to get like AWS access, the other ones don't have to go through the same like long procurement process to be able to just use AWS again. And so it allows agencies to get like the same level of security and same level of authorizations for any of the services that they want without having to repeat the entire like bureaucratic process. And this is like similar to like the moving faster that we see in like private industries.
And this kind of like basically also kind of brings together the like decentralized
point that I had brought up as to like why software procurement is so hard, this basically tries to create like a more like centralized authority that can be a like resource for like local and federal agencies in order to like refer to in order to like ease the software procurement process. And so a procurement official that like isn't a software engineer, they can reach out to FedRAMP and get some of the more like specialized information that they need. And so this is like another like kind of thing that I had been talking about is that like the entire procurement system right now like really works well for unchanging objects. So like I gave the example of road salt, and like procurement works pretty well for road salt in that like that is something that is not like changing rapidly like week to week in terms of like the technology and the chemicals that are being used. But for something like a website or software, that is something that is developed pretty iteratively. It's something that like should be updated and changed over time. But because procurement is this kind of one-time process, everything has to be scoped out all at once. You basically like leave no room for like future improvement. And so one thing that the government has like done in recent years is something called like the USDS Design System. And it's basically, again, this very similar to FedRAMP, and it's trying to ensure accessibility and consistency in some of the software procurement process amongst different agencies. Another thing that like the public sector has kind of taken a lesson from the private sector from is in the context of bug bounties. And so people are probably familiar with this idea of like, if you find a bug in like Google Chrome or Mozilla, you can like reach out to them, reveal the bug, and oftentimes they will pay you for having found this bug. And so the DoD basically tried to run like a similar program called Hack the Pentagon that was led by HackerOne, which is basically this like very big like hacker collective, in which like people all came together and like looked for like different issues in some of the software that the Pentagon was using. And they were able to like pay out about $150,000 for like 138 bugs. And so one thing that like, you know, the public sector might want to do is like contract an outside firm to do like similar kind of security audits on their software. And like basically like go through or like use these kinds of like bug bounty type systems in order to make things better. The quote I have here is basically from someone who had run the event being like, excuse me, if they were to have run kind of like an outside audit through the procurement process, it probably would have been significantly less effective than just like opening the software out and letting like kind of developers like poke around in it. How do government? Yeah, I mean, so that's again, I was going to mention that's a huge challenge, right? In that like a company like a public company or like Facebook or Google is able to do this because their products are public and there's like not necessarily like as much like, you know, like confidential information that has to go through, security clearances that have to be given before looking at these kinds of things. So even in running programs like this, there are still a ton of challenges because just of the sheer amount of like kind of proprietary and very sensitive information that exists in some of these systems.
Yeah, and I think this one specifically is like mainly public facing information, and like a lot of the DoD specific ones are like public facing because that's like where a lot of the like endpoint failures or security issues will come up from.
Mm-hmm. And so the first kind of large and public catastrophe of government technology was with healthcare.gov. And so when Obamacare first launched in the early like 2010s, it basically like the moment I think that the website went up, it like immediately crashed. And I think like approximately only like 10 people that day were able to like sign up for like insurance via Obamacare because of the kind of like swift destruction of the website all at once. And so the vendor in this case was this company called CGI Federal, excuse me. And they were pretty much like just similar to like Deloitte, IBM, this like very large conglomerate software consulting firm that like historically like didn't necessarily have a lot of success, wasn't necessarily like the best choice for this project, but was able to get the contract because they have simply like done other government contracts in the past. And so healthcare.gov had a lot of issues, but some of the key ones was that like there was a lack of leadership. You had like people within the Department of Health and Human Services basically like working on parts of it. Then you had like CGI Federal working on parts of it, and there was like a lack of communication between the two. And so the whole process from start to finish was super disorganized. As soon as the website went down, there was nobody within HHS that could actually like properly troubleshoot the problem because they were not the ones who like wrote the core of the data of the code base. And there was basically like no one to actually kind of do like site reliability engineering like as soon as it went down. And the last thing is that it was like a huge project with very little funding, like building a website in which every single person in the United States is able to build like or able to buy like insurance. That is like a very, very big undertaking. And it like just simply like was not funded in like an adequate way in order for it to be really successful. And so all in all, I think like healthcare.gov was this like kind of awakening, at least for like the Obama administration, that like government technology in general is just like basically like not serving people, not working. And it was like a really good example also of like setting kind of like irrational expectations that like a website like this could be like built and go into production like in such a short amount of time. And so, like I said, this was kind of like a really big awakening for the Obama administration. And so, right after this happened, President Obama at that time basically launched the effort of the United States Digital Service, or the USDS, and 18F. And so it's basically this effort to basically poach engineers from like really big, large tech companies to come and work for the government. And so you're basically getting this like engineering talent that is not just like kind of coming to work in the government, which is really valuable, but also like stick around and develop systems that can then be like well documented and like well preserved for like future people to work there. And so luckily, unlike some things, USDS was able to survive under President Trump. And the unfortunate thing though is that it's still not really big. And so you would hope that like there would be like, you know, like really talented software engineers at all levels of the federal government in order to like create really seamless processes. But right now, USDS is only about 180 people, and they are basically tasked with moving mountains. Their basically entire prerogative is like to improve government technology. And so they've been able to do some really successful projects like improve the entire like refugee asylum process that you can apply for online. But in general, there are still like so much out there that can be improved, and they need like as much help as they honestly can get. A big part again of USDS 2 was trying to pay some of these engineers at market value. And so I think about everyone who comes through gets paid about like 100, who does like a stint in the USDS gets paid about like $170,000 a year, which is very similar to what software engineers get paid in industry. And so this was also kind of like an implicit understanding that you're not going to be able to attract top tech talent if you unfortunately don't compete with some of the top tech companies. And so one thing that this did that was like pretty smart in its approach is that we kind of mentioned earlier that like an issue you see now is that a lot of like young tech people don't necessarily want a career in maintenance. They want to be able to like own different products and like start different projects like from their own like design and their own like implementation. And so by kind of marketing USDS as this stint in the government that you can do, or like a tour, almost very similar to like people who go and do like the Peace Corps for a year or like Teach for America for a year, they're basically able to like get very talented people in and out and like improve existing systems. And so people, because they are committing to less, are more likely to do something like USDS. Another kind of like really interesting solutions that were coming out of like different cities and different areas towards the kind of like software procurement difficulties is like the city of Boston is basically going towards something called results-driven procurement, which is basically, like I mentioned, like they are not like from the get-go like specifying exactly what needs to be done. They are trying to write contracts that move like organically with like the software development process. And this basically just allows for better RFPs or like bid proposals to get written and better like interfacing between like vendors and the government. An example from across the pond is in the UK, they basically have launched this thing called gov.uk, which is basically a centralized website for all digital resources for UK citizens. So instead of having to hop around to things like healthcare.gov, irs.gov, and things like that, like you can have like a very centralized location for all of those things. The UK has also done a pretty decent job in like really, really heavily investing in broadband, which has like come obviously really in handy during COVID. Another thing that's really interesting that the UK has done is they have basically taken on projects that can be championed by the private sector, and like with that like be a lot more effective, and so they created this basically like government run banking API. Like if any of you are familiar with the company Plaid, that basically what they provide is just like a service to like every other tech company to like easily do like bank transfers and things like that. The UK government has basically created that project themselves because so many banks in that country are state owned. And because it is like so helpful for so many like UK based tech companies to do payment processing, that project has basically been like a very successful launch in the UK.
And so login.gov is a very like interesting platform that the federal government has built recently to help re-centralize a large portion of the government, which is logging in. And so like when you use different services on like government platforms, you're gonna have to use different sets of logins. And so login.gov centralizes both like all of your information, but also your login access. And like one of the biggest ways that this has helped is like vets.gov. So any sort of vet like from a previous war has to log in through portals or to get help or therapy or anything, will have to go through like hundreds of different login portals. And so one of the first projects was making sure that vets.gov has a single access login portal. And it basically like changed the way like number of people who like actually use this like vets.gov website. And so one of the very like key parts of login.gov that was introduced during the pandemic was that it opened up partnerships with local and state government. And so this is sort of reminiscent of cooperative procurement, but specifically for like login access. And it sort of introduces the idea that like software doesn't have to be created twice. And with the federal government having a lot more resources and technological access to be able to like create like large scale programs, maybe we can use that to help improve like local programs as well. So for example, like if you got the vaccine through APH, you could log in through login.gov rather than having to create an account for like Austin specifically. And so like this hopefully may introduce the initiative to further create federal like services for local government. And so like the OMB actually allows federal technical government or services to be shared with local governments. And this is from like an order passed in like 1969, so way ahead of its time. But it should hopefully allow us to use things like 18F or USDS to improve local government services as well.
Another like kind of cool like solution that's coming out is the Office of Technology, or this is like basically something that has been proposed, and people are really like gunning for and would be, I think, in my opinion, like a game changer, is the Office of Technology Assessment. And so basically like the role of this agency would be to like sort through and provide advice to like different levels of government. And so again, like I kind of mentioned this issue in which like a procurement official in a local government is just tasked with doing like way too much. Like they basically have to buy everything from like chairs for like a school to like Google Classroom, like enterprise edition for a school. And so the Office of Technology Assessment would be able to provide like objective and authoritative analysis on like very complex scientific and technology issues, and assist federal employees with like the technology procurement process. And so this is actually something that already existed that a lot of like civic tech advocates are trying to bring back. It was pretty successful when it did exist in like the early 1990s, but it ended in 1995 with basically like Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House at the time's plan to get rid of a bunch of like government agencies that he deemed to be useless. And so this is kind of like an example of like politics kind of like coming in the way of like certain things that could be like really effective and like really, if done right, could be like a really big boon for a lot of people. And the last thing that is honestly like really could make a really big difference and kind of like easing this process and making it a lot more seamless is just by like changing policy. And so like right now, like policy makes it really hard to build nice web apps. If anyone has ever like gone through and like read like something like an unemployment insurance bill, it is extremely complicated, and there are like literally like layers upon layers upon layers of like qualifications and information that has to be collected before you can claim a benefit. And so the entire process of like turning a law into a website is kind of hard, and part of the reason is because laws are really poorly written. And so like 30% of all like UI benefits applications still aren't available online, partially in due to the fact that they are just like really horrible forms to fill out in person anyways. And so like no one basically wants to go through the effort of like putting that kind of a form online. And so some solutions to this is by doing things like remote eligibility screening, application and enrollment tools. So basically like being able to prove eligibility for something like food stamps or unemployment benefits, like really easily online. Mobile first solutions. So there are like certain startups that are basically trying to make it really easy for you to claim like SNAP benefits via like a cell phone app. So you can like basically go through the entire eligibility screening on the phone, get the benefit, and then go like to a grocery store and like claim it right then and there. And lastly, you know, like letting people test. Like I mentioned the like Paperwork Reduction Act and how like there's like just like so much confusion and like so much like kind of like misinformation around like government A/B testing. And so letting people test and it basically like change policy as like you need as needed, as seen fit, that in general I think would make this process a lot less painful. And so this is kind of like a really funny tweet that I think like embodies this idea of like things just being so hard to like access. It's like this is actually like a speaker we had on our Civic Tech Careers panel last semester. She works for the USDS. And she was like, every time a politician tells you they're helping a specific kind of person, I want you to imagine that person filling out endless forms to prove themselves. And so something as simple as like SNAP benefits being like, you know, I don't make enough money to like adequately feed myself and my family, so I need some assistance from the federal government. That process can often take like months to be like actually like properly like screened for eligibility and become qualified for. And so just like streamlining that process can help like bring access and bring like more resources to a ton of people. And so another like kind of cool effort that we're seeing right now is that Ron Wyden, who is a senator from Oregon, who is oftentimes like just like on top of all things like tech policy, he basically has this plan to try and like improve unemployment systems right now. And so he's appropriating about $500 million to the Department of Labor to serve as like a centralized resource for states. And so this bill is like really smart in a lot of ways, because it aims to be very modular so that like whatever the Department of Labor is developing with this money can be really easily like taken by local governments, very like open source, and they can integrate it very easily into their systems. The other thing that's really cool is it creates like basically it appropriates money to hire people to be a permanent maintenance team for like these open source systems that local governments would be using. And so it'd be staffed with like real engineers and real designers that can basically like maintain these systems and make sure they don't become like these like creaky, like kind of old COBOL systems that currently exist. And so, you know, you might be wondering after this, like, I want to be an engineer who, you know, is building government technology and is like really making a difference in the realm of like serving millions and millions of people. And so there are a lot of really cool opportunities to get involved. The first thing I would recommend for people to like look into are open government initiatives. And so Open Austin is basically like the open government / Code for America chapter here in Austin. And so they basically build a lot of cool different tools that like the city of Austin uses in order to like distribute like different resources to people. And so the city of Austin, interestingly enough, is actually like I would argue, like quite a modern city, and that they care a lot about trying to like create like digital infrastructure for people to like get access to things. Like, I don't know if anyone has ever booked a COVID test through like the Austin Public Health, but it's a just a wonderful process. Actually, it's very seamless. And it's very easy, and that is in large part due to like a city government that like really cares about making those processes really good. Code for America, like I mentioned, was basically like this initiative founded like several years ago of like engineers who wanted to get more involved in civic technology. And so not only do they like hire a lot of people to do a lot of this work, but they also maintain like a job board that has like a lot of different civic tech opportunities. And I think if you want to work on things like login.gov or just in general, like improving existing systems, I highly recommend looking into a career in like the USDS or 18F after you graduate. Or even now, there are like amazing programs that like create like just like extremely successful alumni. And in general, they're like very, very cool. And so, yeah, that basically like concludes our presentation. And yeah, it's like kind of like a quick primer to like the world of like civic tech, procurement, government technology. And so we hope that was like helpful to people, and you know, you're all feeling like super inspired. But we will basically like I think be available for the next like however long in order to like take questions from people. But yeah, I think like we have an office hours for like a whole hour afterwards. I'm guessing there's not going to be enough people to be there for a whole hour, so we'll stick around until maybe